Well, thank you all for coming. It's really nice to see you all. Hey, this talk. Well, before I get into the talk, I want to thank Daniel Boucher and Wei Ming Xie and everybody at EAP for putting this all together. The food is wonderful, and it's nice to be back at Cornell. I used to teach here from 2008 to 2018. And I've been in this room many times, both as a presenter, but also as an audience member. One of the things that I can see just from looking around the room is that there's a lot of people, younger people here. And I gave a version of this talk at the University of Michigan about a month and a half ago. And it was also a very young crowd, which is exactly the potential audience for this. So I'm very happy to, and when I mean a young crowd, of course, I also am referring to SHRM as well. This is really something that I think the motivation behind it is something that really had younger scholars and scholars to be in mind. So, just to, for those of you who don't know who I am, my name's Andrew Mertha, and I'm the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And what I want to talk about today is, well, before I talk about what I want to talk about today, let me talk a little bit about other projects that so I'm currently in the stages of, well, this book is done. It will be out on sometime next month or in May. It's going to be open access, so it'll be free. So there's no excuse not to read it, except that it's not on China. It's on Cambodia and it's on the Khmer Rouge. But it's one of the things about it is, while I was working on it, it was very much, I learned a lot about China through a comparative perspective. So it was really interesting in that regard. And it's a really, I think it's an interesting story. And I tried to tell it in a way that is of interest, not simply to Cambodia. And then on the right there is the project that I'm starting now. It's going to be a long-term project, just at the very early stages, but it's on rectification in China. So it's on other ways of describing it as thought reform or thought work, 思想工作, and so that's at the very early stages. And hopefully I'll be presenting some aspect of that in the not too distant future. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to talk about today is a publication that my center, the Center for the SAIS China Research Center, put out last fall, and it's something that I think will hopefully be of interest to you all. And let me just kind of contextualize it by going into some of the motivations for it. So when I first came to Washington, D.C. in 2018, I was not prepared for the type of culture shock that I experienced when I was there. True, I expected something. I mean, Ithaca is very much kind of the poster child, if you will, of the ivory tower. I mean, when you walk downtown and you look up on the hill at the very top are the buildings of Cornell and the professors and the scholars and the students all looking down on the rest of the world. It's very easy to kind of get the sense that this is really a crucible of learning that is not as impacted by the outside world as one might think. So falling into that stereotype. But as I said, I was not prepared for what I experienced in China, not in China, in Washington, D.C. So what were some of the things that I experienced? Well, one was there's a deep unfamiliarity with China. On day one of any China course that I offer, the first thing I say is that China is not a monolithic state. And I talk about things like when people refer to the Chinese government, they say, well, then my response to them is like, well, which government are we talking about? Are we talking about Beijing? central government? Are we talking about the 36 or so provinces? Are we talking about the 300 or so prefectures, the 2,000 or so counties, or the 41,000 townships? You get the point that and that for them, that's an epiphany. Even though that's really day one of China 101. So there's that. There's also been a hollowing out of the deep state. We're seeing that in real time as we speak. So just yesterday, so over the weekend, I'd heard that the Wilson Center has closed. Yesterday, I was reading that the U.S. Institute for Peace, USIP, has been essentially mobbed by some officials and enforcers from DOGE. So we don't really know what the future of USIP is. So there really is an assault on essentially our knowledge base, not simply in terms of our institutional knowledge of how these places work, but also kind of the deep knowledge of working with our counterparts in other countries, China being one of, if not the most important. Third, there's very much an elite top-down focus. Of course, I'm going to be essentially be embracing that focus in today's talk. But I think there's this overall thinking that if Xi Jinping wakes up with a toothache, then it's time to really circle the wagons around Taiwan, because doesn't quite work that way. There's a lot of slack in the system, intentional and unintentional. We also have, there's a proliferation, there has been for the past several years, a proliferation of China desks. So having an in-house person who's an expert on China. The problem is these are, at least in my experience, these are smart people, but they don't really have a real strong depth of understanding of China. And there's all sorts of other incentives, for example, or disincentives. So the students that I generally teach now are people who are going to go into public service. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And if all things being equal, if they ask me, should I go to China for a year or two just to experience China and get to know China on a different level than just reading about it or hearing about it or learning about it at arm's length? My answer is yes, absolutely. You'll learn more in 1 year there than you'll learn in 10, 15 years. And there are certain things that you can't learn otherwise about China. And yet they're all worried about going there because if they do so, they won't pass their security clearance. Now, there are people like me, I lived there for 7 years. There's no way I'm ever going to get a security clearance. So but that's not the kind of job I'm looking for. They all are. And so there's a real disconnect in terms of experience versus kind of career trajectories and opportunities. The media discourse and the overall incentives are for us to be hawkish on China. China hasn't made things easy for those of us who are more pro-engagement. And so this has been kind of a spiral that we've been seeing. And then just the last point is when I first came to SAIS, I was heading a program, the program on China Studies, which was led by my immediate predecessor, Mike Lampton, and before him, Doak Barnett, who's a giant in the China field. We'll come back to it just a moment. And so, but 2 years in, they restructured all of SAIS from the inside. And so my question to myself was, well, what do we do kind of moving forward? How do I distinguish what I'd like to be able to do at SAIS and keep it relevant? And I think the thing that I finally landed upon was this notion of it's important to understand China, but we also have to know how to understand China. Like, how do we know what we know? How do we learn what we learn? And so that took me back to my old stomping grounds when I was a doctoral student at Michigan, where in the political science department, we had methodological courses kind of pretty much beat into us. And so, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. Okay. And so essentially what I came up with is this, the SAIS China Research Center. We have our own website, which I'll subsequent slides will have that. You can Google it, where everything that I'm going to be talking about today is available. The site is still in the process of getting some of the bugs out, but you should be able to access a lot of the things there. And essentially the theme or the thesis of the center is we don't just study China, we study how to study China. And that takes me back to this notion of research methods. So I think there's been a false dichotomy about methodological rigor versus area studies. In the department, the disciplines and the departments, particularly the social science disciplines and social science departments, really want to elevate the notion of science at the expense of nuance, idiosyncrasies, and things like that. And so I think that it's important to underscore that even those of us who do not employ quantitative analyses, nonetheless also have our own kind of methodological rigor. Probably the easiest way to say that is the distinction between internal validity versus external validity. But our focus on internal validity is very, very strong, or it should be. The way in which we learn about how to do things in China, unfortunately, there's not a real, some people are lucky in that they get to sit down with their advisors and, over my idea coming back to graduate school is that we would sit by the fire, and drink brandy, and I'd listen to all these stories about what they used to do back in the day. And that wasn't how my advisor did things. He was very much, okay, you got 15 minutes, what do you have for me? And so what I wanted to do was kind of create a platform where we could trade war stories, pass down knowledge. I mean, to be fair to my advisor, some of the most important advice that he gave me was along those lines, but it was somewhat sporadic. And he was of the notion that you really need to experience the stuff for yourself and learn it by yourself. And there's, I think there's an argument to be made there. But one of the things I was really interested in was this notion, SAGE Publications has these little green pamphlets. And I thought what I'd like to do maybe, and this is the way it all kind of crystallized, was to maybe do something akin to this, but have it be the methodology of studying China. And so what I'm going to be talking about today in this publication is very much it's the first iteration of this. So I think one of the things to think about is, in terms of the motivations, like, is this, what necessitates this? And, one of the things that, when you've been doing this long enough, you can really see kind of historical trends, and not simply as something to study, but something that have really shaped your own work, your own opportunities, your own constraints, et cetera, et cetera. And I look back to the years between 2004 and 2006, which is when I was working on what eventually became my second book on hydropower politics in China, as really a time that China had never been as open as it was at that time. I mean, it really was, doesn't mean that anything goes, but it was surprising to me how much access we were able to have, how free certain people were to talk. And there didn't seem to be the kind of anxiety about kind of talking to foreign researchers, and foreign researchers didn't have the kind of overwhelming anxiety that we have today in terms of protecting our interlocutors. There was a lot more gray than black and white, and so there's a lot of stuff that you could, as long as your apology afterwards was accepted, you could get away with. And there were really, you could really embed yourself in these approaches. There's, we have a colleague at, I think it's at SUNY Cortland, is it, so I want to make sure I have her, is it Tian Zhang? She's an anthropologist, and she wrote a book about subject prostitution and karaoke hostesses in Dalian. And she basically posed as one for a fair amount of time, and wrote this fascinating book called Red Nights. I have a former, not a student of mine, but one I've known since she was a doctoral student, Margaret Boytan, who's at York University in Canada, and she just came out with a book on prostitution that was based on extraordinary access that she had, both to to people within the trade, but also to local regulators, and looking at state society relations very much, in a setting that you wouldn't expect somebody who, I mean, she's very light skin and blonde hair, not somebody who could kind of fade into the shadows. And the book is extraordinary. Fortunately, it's really expensive, but I think you can get it through university licenses, and it's really worth reading. Anyway, that was, at that time, things were looking up and up, and of course, what we've realized since then is that things have kind of gone downhill since then from the point of view of a researcher. Which is to say, it is difficult, or the conventional wisdom is that it's been a lot more difficult to get information. The kind of work that I do, which is mainly, it's called lead interviewing, but it's not necessarily, the name is a bit of a misnomer. It's really, it's interviewing as a kind of one-on-one, as opposed to like a more structured and systematic survey process. That is something that I'm very loath to do right now, because I do worry about the people that I'm talking to, and even things like surveys are being closed down, and there's a real chill there. Now, I should also say that I have students who are in the field, and they seem to be having some success, but they have yet to come back, and I've yet to really see the degree that they've been able to get the access that that they say they have, and that I hope they have, in a way that maximizes everybody's security. So I think there's some rather than say that some exceptions. I mean, I think we have to be careful about accepting the conventional wisdom, whatever that conventional wisdom might be. That said, it is much more difficult to do things for people who are doing more archival work in China. There are things that are no longer available that used to be. One of the things that you saw was there was archives were digitalized in the past 10, 15 years. And when they did that, then you lost the opportunity of kind of coming across something in the in the stacks that you weren't supposed to have access to, that just happened to be there. And that was, pretty much that was the kind of the vein of gold that you would then, be able to kind of, in some cases, build a career on, or at least start to build a career on. That is much less the case. And from what I've spoken to with people, researchers in the field, there are certain local archives that are local archives now, unless you have some really good relationship with them, from being from that locality or otherwise, it's much more difficult, if not impossible, to access those. So we're in a situation now where I think it's safe to say, to the degree that it's true, there's also this huge perception, overwhelming perception, that we just cannot do the kinds of things that we wanted to do in China. So where does that leave us? Now, if you're someone like me, where I'm kind of in my wife and I are already talking about retirement. So if we're at that stage of our careers, we could say, well, that doesn't, we had a nice run, and but that's not the point. The point is, what about the younger scholars? What about the people who are going to be carrying the torch, after, we're, kind of ease ourselves or are eased out of the, out of the, out of the academy? What can we leave them? What can we provide them? How can we kind of work with them so that they don't become their own lost generation? And so that was very much the motivation of this project. And one of the things that, that one of the first ideas that I had was to take a step back, to think about the people who were doing scholarship in the late 60s and early 70s, up through, when we really began to have access, Americans anyway, began to have access in the very early 1980s. And, these are just a couple books and other publications that came out of that time. And these were all done without access to China. These were either researched and written in Hong Kong at places like the University Services Center, or in the case of Richard Baum, who collaborated with Fred Tiewes, he was allowed into the Forbidden Room in the Taiwan, I think, Foreign Ministry archives, and kind of snuck these out, which is not something that you should do, but because he did it, we were able to learn what became our knowledge, our universe of knowledge about the four cleanups movement of 1963 to 1965, very much in real time. These were documents that were captured supposedly by nationalist special forces raids into the mainland. So, they've just got their own really kind of cool pedigree to them as well. But generally speaking, these were people who did not have access to China and yet were able to write books that not only just were transformational in our knowledge of China, but in some cases, I'm particularly talking about Doak Barnett's Cadre's Bureaucracy and Political Power in Communist China. I still assign chapters of this to my students because there are huge passages in it that remain quite relevant. So I was thinking, if these now, granted, these are very, very smart people, but if they were able to glean and derive the kind of information that they were able to get from China without going to China, without being in China and being expressly forbidden from going into China, how were they able to do it? And in a worst case scenario, if we are unable to go to China, might we be able to learn some of the kind of the tricks of the trade or draw from their toolboxes for us to maybe utilize those to mitigate the problems that a lack of access brings about? So what I decided to do is I contacted some of the people who were really at the forefront of this field within political science anyway. First is a gentleman named Fred Tiewes, who's emeritus professor of Chinese politics at the University of Sydney. He is somebody who's written some of my favorite books on China. He is somebody who writes with such richness that you almost feel like you're at the meetings between Mao and his colleagues, where you can really almost experience the energy of, say, Mao's argument with Bo Yibo over taxation in 1952. Now you might think, boy, that's really arcane. Who cares about that? But that actually led to what's known as the Gaogang Affair, which became the first major purge, post-1949 purge in China. So Fred really gets into the details, and whether my students like it or not, I pretty much assign his work to all of my students, even today, because what you can glean from that will give you the kind of knowledge that you just can't get anywhere else. And I mentioned that he's at University of Sydney. There's a reason why that's relevant, and that is you can't get away with the kind of work he does in the political science discipline as it's evolved in the United States. I recall I had a conversation with somebody when I was a doctoral student, and I was just over the moon about reading his book called Politics and Purges in China. And I said, I very much want to be like Fred Tiewes. And the response was, well, you'll never get a job in the US. So anyway, I say all of that because, in this case, political science, as I mentioned already, we value the science more than the politics. And for Fred, it's all about the politics. And in my view, I think that's the right place to have the emphasis. I also called Alice Miller, who's at Stanford, for a long time the editor of the China Leadership Monitor, and Joe Fewsmith, who is a colleague and friend at Boston University. And then I also contacted Tom Fingar, who is at the Shorenstein Center at Stanford. But he's somebody who was, went to school with, at the same time as these other people, did not become a scholar per se, and instead went into public service and was in various US government positions. He's also quite extraordinary. So there was this was a really impressive group of people, and I gave them all the same prompt. First of all, I asked them if they were interested. They said yes. So basically, what the prompt I gave them was: China scholars outside China have been scrambling to find new and innovative ways to mitigate these trends. These trends being the closing off of China. One promising avenue is dusting off the tools Sinologists utilized from the 1960s through the 1970s. What were the methods and the strategies that you used? And what specific circumstances privileged one over the other? What were the relationships between the availability of data and the choice of research questions? How were you able to fill in the gaps of data that you encountered and establish an interpretation of it that maintains the requisite analytical rigor of the field? And do these skills developed in the 1960s and 70s travel into the present day? Which ones do and which ones do not, and why? So we were able to answer some of these questions better than others, but essentially what I did was I invited each of them to give a presentation. In the case of Joe and Alice, there's Tom. In the case of Joe and Alice, they did a tag team together. But essentially what we did, this is right after COVID. So this was in 2021. We began, I think, in September, and we finished up in November. And basically what we did is we recorded it. Fred is in Australia, and Tom and Alice are in California. So we were kind of time zones all over the place. And so what we did is we did these recordings. We recorded them on YouTube. And they're on the website. But I thought, that's one way to experience and enjoy these. But what I wanted to do is make it a bit more accessible. Now, one of the ways in which they become more accessible is that I don't know if you are familiar with Kaiser Kuo and his Sinica podcast. But what Kaiser very generously did was he took the audio of these presentations and cleaned them up. So you don't have all the ums and ahs and pauses and mispronunciations and things like that. And he really cleaned them up quite nicely. And so about a month or so ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, he did the first one with Fred Tiewes. You can get it on the a podcast app of your choice. He's archived them. And then I think just a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, he did the one with Joe and Alice. And then we'll get the one with Tom. And Kaiser hopes to have each of these people on his podcast to discuss this as well. So that really gave us some quite a bit of exposure that we wouldn't normally get. In fact, I got an email from a buddy of mine from undergrad who said, "Hey, are you the Andy Mertha that?" Yes, I am. So that was really nice. But ultimately, what I wanted to do was to actually have a tangible publication, either in hard copy or in soft copy that could be open access for people to be able to take and share and use. And so this is a new way, at least for me, it was a new way of doing something like this. Rather than have each person write something, which I knew which is something I didn't want. I like the idea of having this kind of fireside chat, if you will, with them. So rather than have them write something, we just transcribe the talks. So I had some research assistants of mine work with me to transcribe the talks. And then and what I wanted to do is what I did is combine them into a single person narrative. So that, there's having a lot of problems with the pronouns. In this case, the pronouns being third person or the royal we, or we. It wasn't the royal we, it was really kind of those, all of us together. But essentially what it is I tried to make it as flowing as possible. I tried to keep it folksy. So when some of them, dropped, I don't think anybody drops the F-bomb here, but, when somebody was, kind of being kind of Maoist in his, in his language, to keep it in. What the publication is it's a combination of, in some cases, extensive quotes, but others, but for the most part, it's a narrative that I edited into being some sort of a kind of a coherent whole. One of the problems, of course, is that people speak in different ways than they write. And so a big challenge that I had was getting the spoken English into something that remained folksy, but was stimulating enough on the page. So anyway, what I'm going to do is what I don't want to do is go through the whole publication, because the whole point of this is to get you all to download the publication and read it yourselves. So I don't want to steal any of my own thunder or cannibalize my own. But what I wanted to do is maybe kind of go just touch upon certain bits and pieces of this. And I forgot to mention that Ann Thurston, who is really a titan in the field, was gracious enough to write a preface to it. So she really embraced the idea, and we liked it. We had no idea if anybody else would like it, but it was she really, I think, does a really nice job of contextualizing. And of course, there is a lot of historical content in the thing. It's in the book itself. So what I'm going to do, if I can, is just share with you. Let's see, 35-26. Just a little bit of context from, in this case, Tom's talk. Let's Soviet studies. So let me, how do I get back into the PowerPoint? That's not how you do that in PowerPoint. Okay, thank you. Yeah, this idea, we didn't particularly like communism, but we love China. And so these types of insights, I thought, that's not the kind of thing you usually read, but it's precisely the kind of things I wanted to capture. So we talk about historical context. We also talk about the things that drove scholarship. So, that there were essentially the way in which I was able to aggregate these conversations and presentations was that you had question-driven approaches, which were, which is very much the way we do things today, or at least are supposed to do things today, where, we have this question and we are unable to answer it based on the existing data. And so we go do the research to be able to answer that question. So for example, when I was doing work on hydropower, that was very much based on an historical anomaly where then Premier Wen Jiabao stopped a huge dam building project based on local protest. And when my colleagues asked me, okay, Mr. China guy, can you explain this? My response was, no, I cannot. And so that's what motivated me. Another approach is discovery. Whether it's a document, an interview, what have you. You can essentially build I mentioned the piece by Richard Baum and Fred Tiewes on the 4 cleanups. That was something that Richard Baum stumbled upon, recognized its significance, and essentially created both the question and the answer. Okay, I'm gonna, just because I see that I'm a bit short on time. I want to leave enough time for us to chat. Let me go kind of move forward a little bit and talk about, in this case, discovery. So there's this wonderful quote by Simon Lees, who was talking about China in, I think, around 1972, 1973, where you would, sometimes in all innocence, a woman at the market stall where you buy your pound of apples, or the cobbler who repaired your shoes, will absentmindedly give you your goods wrapped in a taboo old local newspaper. Needless to say, the dirty and crumpled sheets were then smoothed over lovingly by China watchers, who pass them around with trembling hands, deeply excited, and after being multi-photocopied, they end up in the black market in Hong Kong, where various research institutes outbid themselves to. And I think he does a really, really nice job of articulating that. Also, I'm going to go back to Tom because he gives a great version, a great example of this as well. Just want to make sure I am at the right. That's a great example of discovery. Okay. Yeah, and the person's name is Huang Jing. Another part of the publication looks at media analysis. This is something that that both Alice Miller and Fred Tiewes focus on. And they talk about the various types of materials that were available at the time, confidential documents, as well as internal publications. And Alice in particular talked about the difference between open media and internal publications. And I'll get into that in just a moment. I'll only be able to just skim it ever so quickly, but there's been some pushback on that interpretation. That's kind of the whole point of having a publication like this. The other thing is that there was something that previous generations, myself included, relied upon, which is called, we refer to it as FIBIS, but it's the Foreign Broadcast Information Service that was put out by the CIA. And it was a daily, kind of in real time, transcriptions of foreign broadcasts from countries all over the world, including China. And it wasn't just People's Daily, it was also local publications as well. So it was discontinued, I believe, in 1995, 94, 95. But what Alice, argued here is that for people that, people think that internal publications, those are the really, that's where you get the really good kind of juicy stuff. And the open publications, well, that's just the party line. But for her, that actually, the party line is not something that, is to be dismissed, but rather something to be understood for what it is. Which is to say, kind of internal publications they tend to reflect decisions that haven't been made yet. Conversations, debates, tentative plans and policy ideas that are, the reason why they're internal is because they haven't been decided upon yet by whoever, whatever decision-making node there is. Whereas open publications, they've already gone through that process, and that's the centralism of the democratic centralism process. So that is to say, that is where you know where the party stands, and that gives you a clear idea of what the parameters for action are. So now, what are the challenges of these types of approaches? Well, particularly media analysis, which is what we're talking about. One is it's the sheer volume of it. I didn't play you the clip of Alice talking about when they switched the four modernizations that originally began with agriculture, industry, and then they switched from industry to agriculture, and that was this eureka moment of this huge change that nobody understood what it actually was. It just recognized that there was something significant going on there. So you have to go through this stuff, and this stuff can be numbingly boring to go through. And you have to have the kind of self-discipline that I think few people have. And especially in today's world where everything is so fast, it forces you to kind of to occupy a different type of kind of intellectual space where you're comfortable just putting the outside world at arm's length and just focusing on what's in front of you. It's frustrating because you can see that there's something here, but you just don't know what it is. And sometimes when you see kind of the Chinese reach a conclusion as to why this is important, you don't realize that they could be wrong as well. And so the one example of that would be when Hua Guofeng, who was already kind of on the outs, came back, I think, from Japan to Dalian. And the mayor of Dalian had this huge celebration for Hua, and red carpet and everything, not realizing that Hua was already on the outs. And so if you read the paper, of Hua Guofeng having this reception in Dalian, you might think, oh, maybe we were wrong about thinking that he's in decline. And then there are all these intangibles. What is the heat indexed? What are which are kind of usually we have a better sense of that in retrospect. So in April and May of 1989, I think what this is a point that Joe Fewsmith made. Maybe we should have been paying closer attention or been a bit more sensitive to just kind of the level of lack of a better word, heat in the publications at the time. Moving away from media analysis is this idea of kind of deep mining and trying to get information from whatever sources are available to you. This could be archives and databases. It could also include media, ad hoc publications. We learned a lot about the Cultural Revolution through Red Guard publications, not necessarily by reading the lines, but by reading between the lines, as well as from policy documents, which do give you, as Alice had pointed out, certain constraints on behavior. But then even beyond that, there are these, there are more sensitive documents. The personally obtained materials, for example, that I'm working on now on my rectification project. Everybody asks me, where did you get these? And I'm like, I can't really, my response is they fell off a truck, which they may well have done. I mean, people forget that during the Qing, people studying the Qing dynasty, one of my mentors, colleagues, Robert Hagel, said a lot of what we know about his area of interest within the Qing dynasty was based on garbage, like people sifting through garbage and like picking out stuff that hadn't been deliberately burned or destroyed. And so this is kind of one way of thinking about that. Other people might know somebody who knows somebody who can give them access to this or that type of thing. Some people might not give you the materials, but might kind of read them to you, and then try to write them down. And there's all sorts of things: party histories and chronologies, memoirs, interviews, and pointedly, Fred says, not necessarily the interviews that you have with these people, but published interviews that the Chinese historians have had with these people. And so just to give one example, and I'm getting towards the end, but I do want to would be this example that Fred gave about the relationship between Chen Yun and Hua Guofeng. 21-25. And unfortunately, you're going to have a dual image of him talking and me nodding and smiling. So just try to ignore that side of your screen. So again, it gives you the kind of the atlas. Okay, so kind of winding down, one of my hopes was that they would have lots of lessons for the present day. So, I mean, that was kind of the whole point. What would we, how can we benefit from all this? And, unfortunately, I wasn't, some of these lessons are not as satisfying as I hoped that they would be. So one question is, this notion of comparability, both in terms of, China under Mao or China during the Huaguofeng interregnum, is in many ways quite different from the China of Xi Jinping. I mean, the power dynamics at the very top arguably are quite different. There's also the availability of materials. On the one hand, we say we have less access. On the other hand, we do have just all sorts of materials available to us that they did not, and it could be overwhelming. And these materials are things that you could get online. Or they could be things where, I'll just give an example. The opening salvo of the Cultural Revolution was an editorial written by Ya Weiyan in the Wenhuibao in November of 1965. And it was a critique of a play that had been written by one of Pengzhen's vice mayors, a guy named Wu Han, and the play was called Hai Rui Dismissed from Office, or Hai Rui Bagua. I'd been looking for an original of this newspaper article for decades, literally decades. And I finally just found one by going on Taobao. Right? And you have people who are doing all sorts of stuff using, hook or crook to get these materials. Okay, there's disciplinary imperatives. So for example, if you're an up and coming scholar in political science, leadership is not a variable or an explanation that holds much water in political science, because it is by nature idiosyncratic. And it goes against that grain of science that the discipline, holds as being far more important. I talked about attention spans. It also, one of the things that both this publication and the one that I'm working on right now, it underscores the fact that when we have an absence of certain types of information and the presence of other types of information, as that changes, our research questions also change. And so it raises, kind of at a meta level, these other questions on what are we not studying? What are we missing? What are the empty spaces that we're not able to analyze, and so on and so on. So what are the next steps? I'm currently working on a second publication. It features Mike Lampton, Bill Hurst at Cambridge, Maria Repnikova at Georgia State, and Maggie Lewis, who's at Seton Hall. And the theme there is studying China from elsewhere. I'm also trying to weave some of my own experiences into that, but it's very difficult without making it sound very self-referential, which is the last thing I want to do. So I'm still trying to find a way to square that circle. But for those four and for myself, one of the things that we've been able to do is study China from a physical vantage point that is outside of China. And given China's growing presence in the world, that actually makes an awful lot of sense. Again, the problem is, what are the questions that we're not asking? What are we, if we're privileging China's international behavior, we're not spending as much time on China's domestic politics. I'd mentioned the partnering with Sinica, so keep your eyes and ears open. And as far as new topics for this series, I am absolutely open to suggestions. And so, like I said, I'm working on the studying China from elsewhere. Not really sure where, what the third one is. I'm thinking we have a lot of political science, not a lot. We have some political scientists now who are looking at big data in China, but big data from like the Song Dynasty, or the Tang Dynasty. And they've managed to get some leverage with that. But there's been some backlash from at least some historians that I've spoken with saying like, well, it's not just the data. You got to know the history as well. So, I mean, I think that's a really important discussion to have, and that might be, a possible contender. But I'm very much open to suggestions, as I say. And with that, with 5 minutes over, let me stop here and thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very happy to answer whatever questions, comments, pushbacks, critiques, outrages. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm in government as well. I'm in political theory, and my interest is broadly in government. So